Welcome back to Azure Lowlands, and I'm here with Rick and Rasmus, and we're going to be talking all about common Azure traps and how to avoid them. Hey, both.
Hello.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Thanks for joining. We'll just do a quick round of introductions. We can start with Rick and then dive right in.
I get to go first. I'm Rick. I work for a company in the UK called Black Marble. As you can tell from the grey hair, I've been doing Azure consulting for quite a long time now, and I spend my life trying to do sessions on exactly what we're about to talk about, right?
Excellent. Well, I'm Rasmus. I work for the Lego Group. I hope you heard of us. What we do is we inspire and develop the builders of tomorrow, of course. But we also do digital, and I head up developer experience and what we call cloud foundation. So basically anything with hosting at the Lego Group. So what you might also call one of the coolest jobs out there. And I've also been around, so you can see that from the gray beard. and hopefully I can share some of my learnings here today.
Well, we heard it here. Lego Group uses Azure. That's cool. You also use one of my favorite CMSs, Umbraco, but that's another thing for another time. Anyway, let's dive in. So, common traps. I think we've all fallen foul of traps in Azure. There's no pretending that. Everyone's got a bill bigger than they were expecting. Everyone has deleted something that they maybe didn't realize they shouldn't have deleted. What are your thoughts? Are there any particular ones that spring to mind for you? Something you see as pain points on a daily basis with your work?
So we were just talking before we started, right? So let's divide this into a game of two halves. So you do the techie stuff, and I'll do the governance-y stuff, and we'll meet in the middle, right? So I spend so much time with customers who aren't sure how they buy Azure, aren't sure how they manage Azure. You know, they start with a credit card, and bad stuff happens if you spend on a credit card for Azure. They don't know about the better ways to purchase it, like CSP or MCA. And then once they've got Azure, they struggle with most people have one subscription, right? And everything gets poured into that one subscription. It's like, no, don't do that. Separate production from development. And then a lot of people don't know that you can have development kinds of subscriptions with different pricing and different SLAs and all that kind of stuff. So I see an awful lot of people who, if you like, rush into Azure because they've got a project, they think they want to adopt cloud, they throw it at one dev team, and because of that sort of lack of planning, they stumble, and the billing goes crazy because they've put no cost guards in, and that eats all of the budget, and management goes mad, and then they're trying to stuff that horse back into the stable if it's really bolted. So I think there's a lot to be said for don't rush into the cloud, do your learning, do the reading, and frankly, turn up to conference sessions and listen to people like me, like Magnus, who I know you were talking to earlier, like Rasmus, who he's done his top 10 tips earlier on adopting the cloud. So that's the one I want to get in there first.
I was just going to say along those lines, there's probably a reputational damage to the cloud or the Azure brand if, from a management perspective, your first foray into that is a disaster. It costs a load of money, take a load of time. It's not doing what you were promised it would do. So it's really important to get that right if you're trying to adopt cloud in your organization.
Absolutely. The worst thing you can do as an IT manager is hack off the finance director and the non-IT management because you've fumbled the ball on that first adoption, right? Because it's a big step for most organizations to adopt cloud, and it's a big move as they shift from on-prem.
So if we are doing worse traps out there still, because I totally agree with the cost, so maybe we can come back to that one. But I see a different one, and it is related though. But it is not being very deliberate that when you move from classic data center compute into public cloud, it's a different canvas. It's a different paradigm for your architecture. And if we don't have the curiosity in the organization, and if we don't have this conversation of the paradigm shift for how you build in a data center, which is with virtual machines, and how you build in cloud, which is using building on a higher abstraction, using as a service, right? Database as a service, queuing as a service, API gateway, etc. If we don't talk about how the architecture changes, then we end up building exactly like in a classic data center, where you're going to start with a network that is connected to your client network, etc. You're going to put in some firewalls, make it DMZ, put in some virtual machines, and you're just going to copy what you did before. And what you actually end up having is a more expensive data center. It's just hosted with a cloud provider. And you could easily do this cheaper. So when I'm super curious what goes on in other businesses, right? And I keep update by talking to my peers in other organizations. And the ones that's moving back, because it was too expensive and it didn't deliver on the promise, so they moved back to on-premises. What they actually did, many of them, I don't want to generalize, but many of them, is that they just did exactly the same processes, architecture. They didn't change the paradigm when moving from classic data center to the cloud. And I see that's, in my book, the biggest trap that I've seen.
Just to counterpoint that one, because I agree with you entirely on that, but one of the things I see a lot of development teams stumble with is they feel that they should be doing cloud differently. It's this terrible rush to containers, right? So I work with an awful lot of organizations that have long-standing .NET development teams. They've been building on-prem applications for a long time. But when they move to the cloud, some external organization comes in and says, no, you should be writing, I don't know, Azure Functions in Python or whatever. And the development team is unsure, but, well, it's an outside influence. They've got to be right. So they start to pivot to a new technology stack. And they're learning too many new things at once. And I think Rasmus is absolutely right. If you're adopting cloud, then you should be looking at PaaS services and serverless and maybe containers if that's right for you. But what you shouldn't be doing is throwing away all of that experience that you've got in your existing development teams and throwing away all of the understanding you have of the stacks you've been working on for the past 20 years just because now we're moving to the cloud.
That's a fantastic point. So the cost savings you might get from adopting those PaaS products add other operational costs to team overheads, training, etc., that perhaps you don't factor into that equation. And so maybe taking a rational approach, looking at this is what we've got and here's what we could move it to, or here's maybe something somewhere in the middle where we're getting halfway there, and as we get a bit more experienced, we could look to explore, say, serverless, but for now we're going to move our .NET app over to app service, for example, and just leave it there, no containers just yet. Could be a more pragmatic way of looking at it.
Yeah, but it's the decisions of the past that is keeping us from realizing the dreams that the cloud promise, right? So often what we find is that it's the monolithic architectures that's really difficult to compose. I mean, they are, right? We want to, but we can't. And because of the monolithic architecture, we cannot tell one team, hey, you need to refactor, go to cloud, learn a new skill set, forget the old one, right? And that I call that the long-tail technology landscape that we have to deal with, right? Because if we don't start chopping off in the long end of the tail, like we still have applications on Power Platform, we still do bare metal hosting, we have all this technology we need to cater for, and the new stuff, then the cognitive load of the organization artificially bloats.
Yeah.
So there's some really difficult conversations to have is, should we prevent from using new technology? I hope not. But should we then not start chopping off in the long tail and maybe refactor some of the monoliths into modern architecture so the organization can move on? Because I think that is the difficult conversation to have. And often it's not sponsored because it works. But you need to also start at the core. Otherwise, you will not get there.
I think very often people are seeing this cloud migration challenge as a infrastructure challenge, and from what you're saying there, it's actually a collective development, operations, finance as well, led project. And maybe that's a trap that we're thinking about it in the wrong way. It's not a collaborative process when we're looking at a cloud migration.
So I think it's very true that you cannot do cloud without doing DevOps. increasingly, I'm finding at the moment that I'm talking to organizations who are being pushed forwards because of the great Server 2012 extinction, right? But those organizations don't have the internal practices and processes to be able to successfully adopt the cloud. So they're doing lift and shift infrastructure migrations. They're treating it exactly as you said, right? It's traditional IT. But developing on cloud, you need robust deployment pipelines. You need infrastructure as code. You need to be able to repeatedly and reliably push out what you're building, because that's how you get the real benefit and economies of doing cloud. And again, organizations tend to rush into cloud and they haven't got that foundation of good practice. And I think, again, that's some of the stuff that you talk about in your sessions, right? The work that you're doing inside Lego to help improve those practices.
Yeah, no, so one thing we do is, I call it monitor your cloud adoption, but it's actually, you need to get into the details. And that is to understand what kind of architecture you're building, right? Are you building the right one, or are you building the less right one? Let's not blame anyone here. But we count the number of virtual machines. And I am not a big fan of virtual machines, if you haven't noticed. Because I think a virtual machine is a symptom that you're either moving around some legacy, or that you're buying the software you're hosting the wrong way. Right? Why would I buy a software application from Rick and then install it on my servers and then run it? I mean, you build it, you run it, right? That also goes between organization boundaries. So first of all, avoid the virtual machines. Keep an eye on them, at least. See if you're growing. You should be decreasing the number of virtual machines to have a more modern architecture. And if you're afraid or if you're concerned about login to a specific technology, Kubernetes is a great alternative, right? But virtual machines is, for me, is a symptom that we might not be doing the right thing, might not be having. So keep an eye on that, and potentially put some friction into getting one, right? Maybe you have to do 10 push-ups to get a virtual machine or something like that, or approval or something like that.
But quite a lot of infrastructure managers might struggle with that, so that's...
Yes.
I am saying nothing.
Not us, of course.
I was gonna, I guess, by virtual machines there you mean virtual machines provisioned for the sole purpose of hosting something, rather than, as in you putting something on it, rather than a virtual machine backing another service, like, for example, AKS spins out a lot of virtual machines under the hood.
But you don't see those virtual machines, right? I mean, I've got to say, though, I think of Kubernetes as IaaS, not PaaS. I think Azure Container Services I prefer as an abstracted way of doing containers. Yeah. I want to get away from managing all of those things if I can. And I think trying to put some technology governance in that encourages your teams to use cloud-native services will give them the freedom to architect better applications that will scale better, that it can be operated better. And obviously, so Martin Thwaites is here today as well. You know, don't forget about telemetry. Don't forget about observability. It's not like the old days where we just used to look at the Windows event log and plug it into our management tooling. Now we want something that's much more immediate, and that sort of distributed tracing and learning how we monitor and manage our apps in the cloud is as important as how do we architect them and how do we write them, right?
You just gave me a smile there when you talked about the event log. I just had a nostalgia trip. I have a number of hours I spent browsing through the event log. Oh my God. Yeah, so...
Now we write KQL, which is great.
Okay, I've got a question I was going to ask, which is, I have a legacy Windows VM, it's running a .NET application, let's say, and I've decided I want to move that over to Azure Web Apps. Now, let's say I also have a database running on that same server. It's happened. People do that. So I've decided I'll move that SQL database over to Azure SQL. So I'm going full PaaS. That's awesome. How do I work out, how do I size up the resources that I actually need in Azure? How do I work out what that's going to cost? How do I go to my boss and say, here is what I need and how much money you need to give me to make that happen? Where do you even start with that process?
I knew he was going to look at me for that. It's like you saw my conference session last year, right? So let's separate this into a game of two halves. So there's the technology migration. And I'm a big fan of experimentation there. You probably wouldn't be surprised at how often you can just take that application out of IIS, drop it into App Services, and it just works. You know, we change the connection strings, and now we're talking SQL Azure. But there'll always be things that trip you up. Usually AD. The example I've been talking about, we've got SQL remote blob storage, and that's a real anchor around my neck, that one is. So that you need to encourage the dev team to go through a period of experimentation. And part of what you are looking for in that period of experimentation is seeing how your application performs in the cloud. But before you start that, you should instrument your application on-prem because you want to know how it operates. So when we're working with customers, he says, struggling to get the words out, the first thing we do is we just install the App Insights agent on the server on-prem. And we start gathering telemetry about memory usage and performance and how many SQL calls we're making and that kind of stuff. And we look at SQL Server and we see how that's performing. And that information we then use to make an educated guess at what we think the scale of the PaaS services are going to be. And then as part of our experimentation, we're testing that hypothesis. We drop the application in the cloud. We start doing some load testing and some perf testing on it. Because with the best will in the world, right, you can run the tools that say, oh, well, based on your SQL server, you want an Azure SQL that is this big. But until you actually operate it, you're never going to know.
Microsoft even have a converter tool that says, you know, I've got X amount of cores and you need this in Azure SQL. It's like, yeah, but do you? I feel like those lead to over-provisioning or massively under-provisioning.
Because on-prem we give ourselves lots of headroom, right? Because a VM is cheap.
Well, I think one attack angle to the problem, because there's also the value conversation. What's the value of refactoring or replatforming the app and spending the effort in that, right? So it's a priority question. I think if it's not clear what the value of this is, then let's have some conversations around what good architecture is, and let's have some conversation around the value of going to a modern architecture. I think we all want to decompose our application, run microservices, have a loosely coupled architecture. Right? I hope so. Otherwise, let's have that conversation. What's the value of having a loosely coupled architecture? So let's talk about APIs, right? Let's stop doing network-based integrations where we are depending on the corporate network. Everything should be API-enabled. If you want to have business agility in your digital products, right? So APIs first. That should be a strategy, I suggest. And then cloud is awesome. We all love the technology, but it is actually also awesome for other reasons. And that is, again, supporting a loosely coupled architecture. Cloud is extreme multi-tenant. That's a whole business model. You can have many tenants, and you can also have multi-tenancy internally, right? So every subscription holds either an application or maybe even a microservice, depending on how you want to do it. And then it's isolated. There's no network. The cost doesn't flow over, right? You start to gain control of your architecture, and you start to loosely couple your thing. And if it's not realized that the business value here is business agility, then maybe you need to change your managers. Okay, maybe that's easier said than done. But
That's awesome.
wait, are we recording this?
I think you just put yourself out of a job, mate.
We're good. Listen, I don't mind bragging about this. It is actually out there in podcasts and whatnot. So our board of directors has an interest in our API adoption and our cloud adoption. And we report on it on a quarterly basis. It's called percentage of application that are on cloud or modern hosting platforms. And I measure that, I report on that to the board of directors. So that will give a push to the organization. But not everyone is that lucky, right, to have owners that cares about this.
I guess they even if they don't care about the tech necessarily, they probably see it as a risk mitigation, a future-proofing of their digital estate and their infrastructure. So
this is directly linked to business agility. We want to be able to respond quickly. We want to be able to innovate without having to wait for the service to be delivered, right?
Yeah, and then built and pieced together and racked and yeah. I was going to ask about Marketplace. So for me, the Azure Marketplace there's a lot of traps in there. It's very easy. I'll take one simple example of Redis. So until only a few years ago, Microsoft didn't actually offer a Redis service. And so the most common scenario is you'd go to the Marketplace and you'd choose a Redis template, and someone would provision you a VM with Redis on it. The problem you then end up with is you generally have to manage that Redis instance yourself. And I think people can quite easily spin up services without realizing the consequences of using those Marketplace things. Some of them also come with a license fee or some other things that the provider that created that Marketplace item is just creaming off the top. So how do we avoid those traps? How do we make sure we're using something that is reputable is not the right word, because there's some very, very, very good Marketplace templates out there, but something that's, Microsoft supported, we know is not going to go away. We're not locking ourselves into something that could cause problems further down the line.
So it's interesting you said Microsoft supported there. I mean, the whole point of the Marketplace is it's trying to allow vendors to fill the gaps, right? But as a consumer, I can still just select the thing through the Azure portal and deploy it. Or hopefully deploy it using an ARM template and provision it that way. I think, again, there's two sides to that. So sure, I can sit here and go, yeah, we can use Azure policies and we can restrict what you can deploy, but actually, fundamentally, what you need is technology governance. You need a set of ground rules that your teams understand that lay out what technologies you are comfortable using. And if somebody wants to add something to that portfolio, what is the process by which that you examine it and go, yes, we're comfortable with this. We're comfortable with how we purchase it. We're comfortable with the vendor it's coming from. We're comfortable with the support model. And if everybody's happy, then you add it to the list. And there are some very good third-party services in the Marketplace, right? And Microsoft are encouraging partners to pour stuff in there, bluntly, because if an organization has put that commercial relationship in with Microsoft, they've got an EA or they've got some kind of purchasing framework, the Marketplace removes a barrier to entry to a lot of technology vendors then. Erasmus is smiling because, yeah, we suddenly find ourselves dealing with these things that have slipped in by stealth, right? What's that doing in our architecture? Oh, well, it was in the Marketplace, and we were looking for an X, Y, Z, and it just did it. So yes, you can lock stuff down with policies, but actually education and governance outside of Azure itself is key.
Okay, so I have opinions on the Marketplace concept, and I'll make it brief, but I honestly don't get it. I think we are trying to build something that was in the past, and we're trying to replicate it into cloud. I just want to buy hosting services from the cloud providers. There's nothing magic about it. And I think it's confusing with the Marketplace. And if I can do a little Azure bashing, is that okay?
Sure.
We were ending on high here. I think that this whole commercial thing where you have to negotiate discounts and against commitments, etc., is in itself a trap. And it's something that is invented because that's what you did in the past. That's how I see it. I don't understand why the cloud providers, and it goes for all of them, don't just provide pricing transparency and make a step ladder. The more you spend, the more discount you get. It's fair. It's not different from going to the supermarket, right? You can buy 1 can of corn or 6, and if you buy 6, it's cheaper. We get that. That's logic. But it destroys the purpose of cloud is when you tightly couple your relationship with Redis through an Azure Marketplace, right? I don't get it, right? I can buy Redis from Redis if I like to, as a service, of course, not on servers. And then, why do I need to commit something? You promised me agility and flexibility, and now you're telling me I have to promise to spend this much to get a proper pricing on it? I don't think so. It goes against the whole paradigm.
Okay, so if we're talking pet peeves then, so my biggest hatred is how you purchase Azure. So a lot of organizations, right, we're software companies with a hobby. We make cars, but we write software. And I see organizations buying Azure through a managed service provider relationship who shouldn't have a managed service provider. They should manage it themselves, right? But if you're an accountant or a law firm, why are you trying to buy and operate your own cloud? That's what the sort of CSP relationship's for. So I think, and that is a big trap. And it's a trap that organizations fall into because we have this traditional software purchasing model, and the people who used to sell as licenses now want to sell as cloud, but they don't necessarily sell as it in our best interest.
What a note to end on. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Rasmus. We'll be back in a short moment.
Thank you.
Thank you.